Security, keep an eye on her, she's about to walk out with money that doesn't belong to her. The words didn't echo loudly, but they didn't need to. They sliced through the polished quiet of the private financial lounge like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads and heavy enough to shift the air itself. And at exactly 11:42 a.m. on a cloudless Tuesday in downtown Chicago, every eye in that room found her without hesitation. Avery Jackson stood there in a fitted charcoal t-shirt, dark jeans, and low-profile sneakers, no designer labels, no visible jewelry, nothing that screamed wealth or power, just a calm presence that didn't match the accusation thrown at her feet. And yet that was exactly why it stuck, because in rooms like this, perception wasn't just reality, it was policy, and policy had already decided who she was before she even spoke. The marble floors gleamed beneath soft recessed lighting, glass walls framed a skyline that whispered exclusivity, and the air carried the subtle scent of polished wood and quiet money, the kind of place where a single glance could determine whether you belonged or not. And Avery had already been judged, not by what she said, but by what she wore, by how she walked in alone, by the absence of everything they expected to see. She approached the desk with measured steps, unhurried, unbothered, her voice level when she spoke. "I need to process a withdrawal," she said, sliding a slim tablet forward. The number wasn't spoken out loud, but it flashed briefly on the screen. Enough for the teller to see, enough for his expression to shift from routine to rigid. A pause, then a glance upward, scanning her again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if recalculating something that didn't add up in his mind. "That's a large amount," he said, not quite questioning, not quite accepting, just placing doubt in the air like a seed. Avery didn't blink, didn't explain, didn't adjust her tone. "Run the account," she replied, simple, direct. But before his fingers could even reach the keyboard, another voice cut in. Colder, sharper, practiced. "Actually, don't." A woman in a navy blazer stepped forward from behind the glass partition, her heels clicking against the marble with controlled authority. Her name tag read Melissa Carter, branch manager, but her posture said gatekeeper, and her eyes, locked onto Avery, carried something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with numbers or policy and everything to do with assumption. "We're going to need verification," Melissa said, crossing her arms, her tone flat but edged. "We can't just process requests like this without understanding where the funds came from." Avery turned her head slightly, just enough to meet her gaze. "You can verify it through the system," she said, still calm, still composed. But the room was already shifting. Two clients seated near the window leaned closer, their conversation paused mid-sentence. A man in a tailored grey suit glanced over his newspaper, lowering it just enough to watch without being obvious, and from the corner, a younger woman with a laptop hesitated, fingers hovering over her keyboard, sensing something unraveling beneath the surface. Melissa didn't move, didn't reach for the system. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, studying Avery like a problem she had already solved. "That's not how this works," she replied, her voice now carrying just enough volume to invite attention. "We've had incidents before, people walking in, trying to access accounts that aren't theirs." The implication didn't land quietly, it spread, subtle but unmistakable, and then came the whisper, not from Melissa, but from behind Avery, a man chuckling under his breath. "Yeah, seen that before," the words barely audible, but the tone loud enough to confirm the shift. Avery stood still, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly at her sides. No tension, no urgency, just presence, and that presence, in a room now leaning toward judgment, felt almost disruptive. Melissa stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it sound controlled, but not enough to keep it private. "We're going to need ID, additional verification, and until then, we can't proceed." Avery reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, placing her ID on the counter, sliding it forward without a word. Melissa glanced at it, barely a second, then set it aside like it didn't carry weight, like it didn't change anything. "That's not sufficient," she said, and then, without hesitation, without pause, she turned slightly toward the security desk near the entrance, her voice steady, practiced, and now unmistakably firm. "Can we have someone come over here, please?" The room didn't gasp, it didn't react dramatically, but it changed. The air tightened. Conversations died completely, eyes no longer pretended not to look, and Avery, still standing in the center of it all, didn't move, didn't protest, didn't defend herself. She simply looked around, taking in every face, every expression, every silent agreement forming in real time, and then, almost quietly, almost like a note to herself, she said, "Keep going," her voice calm, controlled, but carrying something deeper now, something that didn't match the role they had assigned her. I want everyone to hear this. The room did not erupt, it did not need to. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise could have been, the kind that pressed against the walls and settled into every corner like something watching, waiting. And in that silence the security guard at the far end of the lounge straightened his posture and began walking forward, not rushed, not aggressive, just steady, trained, and already convinced he understood the situation before hearing a single word. Avery did not turn toward him. Immediately, she let the moment stretch, let every second deepen the weight of what had just been said about her, the word thief still hanging in the air like it belonged there, like it had been placed with intention. Melissa shifted her stance slightly, confidence settling into her shoulders now that authority had been called. "We are going to handle this professionally," she said, her tone measured but firm, though the emphasis was not on professionalism. It was on control, on containment, on making sure the narrative stayed exactly where she wanted it. Avery's eyes moved slowly across the room, not scanning, not searching, just observing, and what she saw was familiar, too familiar. A man near the window nodding slightly as if this made sense, a woman by the espresso bar crossing her arms, lips pressed thin, not saying anything but agreeing all the same, and then there was the younger woman with the laptop, still frozen, still watching, her expression uncertain, caught somewhere between doubt and realization. Avery finally turned her head toward Melissa, her voice even, almost quiet. "What exactly are you handling?" she asked, not defensive, not emotional, just precise. Melissa did not hesitate. "A suspicious transaction request," she replied, the words coming out clean, rehearsed, already framed for anyone listening, "and until we verify the legitimacy of the funds, we cannot proceed." Avery nodded once, slow, controlled, as if acknowledging a point that had not actually been made. "You saw the account," she said. "You saw the balance." Melissa's jaw tightened slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for the shift to register. "That is not the issue," she said, and there it was, the quiet pivot, the moment where logic stepped aside and assumption took its place. Avery held her gaze. "Then what is?" she asked, and for a fraction of a second, Melissa did not answer, because the truth, the real answer, did not belong in a room like this. Not spoken out loud, not where it could be challenged, so instead she reached for something safer, something that sounded official. "We have protocols," she said, "and right now, you are not meeting them." The security guard had reached them now, standing just off Avery's right side, his presence calm but firm. "I am going to need you to step away from the desk while we sort this out," he said, his tone polite, but his positioning clear. Avery did not move, she did not even shift her weight. "I am not obstructing anything," she replied. "I am requesting a service." The guard glanced at Melissa, waiting for direction, and Melissa gave it without hesitation. "She is refusing to comply," she said, and the word refusing landed differently. It reframed everything, turned stillness into defiance, turned composure into resistance. The man in the grey suit folded his newspaper completely now, no longer pretending to be uninvolved. "If she cannot verify it, that is a problem," he said, not loudly, but enough to be heard. Enough to reinforce the narrative taking shape. Avery's eyes flicked toward him for just a moment, then back to Melissa. "You are building a story," she said, her voice steady, "but you have not asked a single question that matters." Melissa let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "We asked enough," she replied, "and your answers are not adding up." Avery tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, like she had reached a point she had already seen before. Many times, in many rooms, the kind that looked different but felt exactly the same. The younger woman with the laptop finally spoke, hesitant but clear. "She gave you her identification," she said, her voice cutting gently through the tension. "Should that not be enough to at least check the account?" Melissa turned sharply, her eyes narrowing just slightly. "We will handle this internally," she said, dismissing the comment without addressing it. The young woman hesitated, then looked back at Avery, and in that glance something shifted, small but real, the first crack in the room's certainty. Avery saw it, acknowledged it without reacting, then returned her focus to Melissa. "Go ahead," she said, her voice calm, almost inviting now. "Call whoever you need to call." Melissa blinked once, caught off guard by the lack of resistance. "We already did," she replied, gesturing slightly toward the guard. Avery shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "No," she said, "not him." And then, just as the tension tightened again, just as the room leaned forward waiting for what came next, she reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and held it loosely in her hand, not raised, not hidden, just there. Call the people who actually understand what is happening, she added. Her tone unchanged, but something underneath it had shifted now, something colder, something certain, because right now, she continued, her eyes locking onto Melissa's, you are about to make a decision you cannot undo. Melissa did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, brief as it was, did not go unnoticed, not by Avery and not by the room that had slowly begun to shift from silent agreement to quiet observation, the kind that no longer accepted things at face value. The security guard remained still beside Avery, his posture firm but his certainty no longer as solid as it had been moments ago. He glanced once more at Melissa, waiting, but this time there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, not doubt in protocol, but doubt in context, because something about the way Avery stood, the way she spoke, the way she did not react the way people usually did in situations like this, it did not align with the narrative he had been handed. Melissa exhaled slowly, regaining control, or at least trying to. You are not in a position to dictate how we handle internal procedures, she said, her voice sharpening just slightly. But Avery did not flinch, did not raise her tone, she simply unlocked her phone, tapped once, and held it near her ear. This is Avery, she said, her voice steady, precise. Initiate Protocol 6, full escalation, Chicago Private Client Division. There was no hesitation on the other end, no confusion, just a calm, immediate response. Though the voice itself was not heard by the room, Avery's expression did not change, but something in the air did, something subtle, like a current shifting direction. Melissa folded her arms tighter, watching, her lips pressed thin. Who exactly are you calling? She asked, the question meant to challenge, to undermine, but it landed without weight. Avery lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, just enough to respond. Someone who can see what you refuse to, she said, and then she lifted the phone back. Log every interaction from 11:42 onward, including verbal statements, she continued, her tone unchanged, but now there was structure to it, a system unfolding in real time. The younger woman with the laptop leaned forward slightly, her eyes widening just enough to signal recognition of something she did not fully understand yet. The man in the grey suit shifted in his chair, his earlier confidence no longer as firm, because the situation no longer felt simple, no longer felt like a routine disruption. Melissa stepped forward again, her voice firmer now, louder. You cannot record internal operations without consent, she said, and there it was again, the attempt to regain control through policy, through language that sounded official enough to silence resistance. But Avery did not lower the phone, did not argue, she simply replied. I am not recording you, she said, I am documenting this, and the difference, subtle but intentional, hung in the air long enough for it to register. The security guard shifted his stance slightly, no longer angled toward Avery, but standing more neutral, his role no longer as clear as it had been. He began, but his voice lacked the firmness from before. If this is escalating, we may need to involve additional authorities. Avery turned her head toward him, not sharply, just enough to meet his eyes. You already did, she said, and for a moment he did not understand, not fully, not until she added, you just did not realize which ones. Melissa let out a short, controlled laugh, the kind meant to dismiss rather than engage. This is not going to intimidate anyone, she said, but her tone had shifted, just slightly, just enough to reveal the crack beneath it. Avery ended the call, her thumb pressing the screen with quiet finality. Then she looked around the room again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if marking the moment, as if recognizing that something had already changed even if no one had said it out loud yet. You called me a thief, she said, not accusing, not raising her voice, just stating a fact, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any argument could have. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out immediately, because now the words felt different. Now they echoed back in a way they had not before. Avery continued, you did not check the account, she said, you did not verify the data, you did not ask a single question that could confirm or deny your assumption. Her tone remained level, but each sentence landed with precision, with intent. You saw me, and you decided. The younger woman with the laptop closed it slowly, her attention fully on Avery now, no longer divided, no longer passive. The man in the grey suit shifted again, uncrossing his legs, leaning forward slightly, as if trying to reassess what he thought he understood. Melissa straightened her posture, forcing control back into her voice. We followed protocol, she said, but it sounded thinner now, less certain. Avery tilted her head slightly. No, she replied, you followed a pattern, and that word, pattern, settled into the room like a truth no one wanted to name. The security guard glanced between them, then took a small step back, not leaving, but no longer advancing, no longer enforcing, just observing, because the situation had changed, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally. Avery slipped her phone back into her pocket, her hands returning to her sides, calm, steady, as if nothing about this moment required urgency. "You still have time," she said, her eyes returning to Melissa. "Run the account." And for the first time since this began, the command did not sound like a request, it sounded like inevitability. Melissa did not move right away, and that stillness, small and almost invisible, carried more weight than anything she had said so far, because for the first time since this began, she was no longer fully in control of the moment. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the terminal behind the desk, then back to Avery, as if calculating something she could not quite articulate. The room felt tighter now, not louder, not chaotic, just charged. Like something was building beneath the surface that no one could stop once it started. The security guard remained where he was, but his posture had softened, no longer angled to intervene, just present, watching, waiting, unsure which direction this was going to turn. Avery did not speak again immediately. She did not repeat herself. She did not need to. The weight of her last words lingered long enough to settle into the room. And that silence began to work against Melissa, because every second that passed without action made the situation harder to control. The younger woman with the laptop shifted her chair slightly, leaning forward now, no longer pretending to focus on anything else. Her voice came again, quieter but firmer this time. "You can just check the account," she said, not challenging, just stating what now felt obvious. The man in the grey suit nodded slightly, almost reluctantly. "It would clear things up," he added, his earlier certainty replaced by something closer to caution. Melissa exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath, then turned toward the terminal, her movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if performing for the room rather than acting on instinct. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped, "we will verify." And as her fingers hovered over the keyboard, there was a brief pause, just a fraction of a second, but long enough to reveal hesitation. Because running the account meant risking something she had not considered before, that maybe, just maybe, the assumption she had built everything on was wrong. Avery watched without expression, her posture unchanged, her hands still at her sides, no tension, no anticipation, just certainty. Melissa began typing, the soft clicks of the keyboard suddenly loud in the silence, each keystroke marking a shift in control. The system loaded, a small delay, then the screen populated, and for a moment, Melissa's face remained neutral, unreadable, but her eyes moved, scanning, recalculating, and then something changed. Not dramatically, not enough for someone across the room to notice, but enough for those closest to see it. The slight tightening of her jaw, the subtle shift in her stance, the kind of reaction that happens when reality does not match expectation. The younger woman leaned forward just a bit more, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen. The man in the grey suit lowered his gaze, no longer watching Avery, now watching Melissa instead, because the center of gravity had shifted. Avery took a single step closer to the desk, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance. "Go ahead," she said, her voice calm, almost encouraging. "Say it out loud." Melissa did not respond immediately, her fingers still resting on the keyboard, frozen between action and acknowledgement. "The account is," she began, then stopped, the words catching, not because they were difficult to say, but because saying them would undo everything that had been built in the last few minutes. Avery did not blink. "Complete it," she said, her tone unchanged, but now carrying an edge of inevitability that could not be ignored. Melissa swallowed, a small, almost imperceptible movement, then forced the words out. "The account is valid," she said, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier authority, and just like that, the room shifted, not with noise, but with recognition, the kind that spreads quietly but completely. The younger woman leaned back slightly, her expression no longer uncertain, now certain of what she had seen unfolding. The man in the grey suit cleared his throat, looking away briefly, as if distancing himself from the narrative he had supported moments earlier. Avery nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something she had already known. "And the balance," she continued, not asking, not requesting, just moving forward. Melissa hesitated again, but there was no space left to avoid it. "It is sufficient," she said, and the words landed heavier than the accusation had, because they did not just confirm the account, they dismantled everything that had been said about her. Avery let the silence sit for a moment, long enough for it to settle into every corner of the room. Then she spoke again. "So the only thing that was missing," she said, her eyes steady on Melissa. Was your willingness to see it? Melissa straightened slightly, trying to recover, trying to pull authority back into her voice. We were following procedure, she said, but the words felt thinner now, less grounded. Avery shook her head once, not dismissive, just precise. Procedure does not call someone a thief, she said, and that word, repeated now in a different context, echoed louder than before. The security guard shifted his weight, stepping back another inch, no longer part of the conflict at all, just a witness. Avery placed both hands lightly on the edge of the desk, leaning in just slightly, her voice still calm, still controlled, but now carrying something deeper, something final. You made a judgment, she said, and then you built everything around it. Melissa did not respond, because there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse, and in that silence, Avery straightened again, her posture returning to neutral, as if the moment had already moved past them. Now, she said, her tone returning to simple clarity, process the transaction, and this time, it was not a request, it was the next step in something that had already been decided. Melissa's fingers hovered above the keyboard again, but this time the hesitation was different. It was no longer about doubt in the account, it was about everything that had already happened, everything that had already been said, because now the system had spoken and it had not supported her. The authority she had leaned on had shifted away from her and into something she could not control, and the room felt it. The quiet tension that had once supported her decisions now pressed back against them. The man in the grey suit leaned back in his chair, no longer engaged in judgment, just observing, distancing himself from the version of events he had almost validated. The younger woman with the laptop folded her hands together, her eyes steady on Melissa now, not Avery, because the question was no longer about whether Avery belonged, it was about what Melissa was going to do next. Avery stood still, her presence unchanged, calm, composed, but now unmistakably centered in the room, not as a suspect, not as an interruption, but as the point everything else revolved around. Process it, Avery repeated, her voice even, not louder, not sharper, just final, and that word settled into the air like a closing statement. Melissa inhaled slowly, then began typing again, this time with less resistance, the system responding quickly, the transaction interface opening, numbers confirming what had already been proven. But even as she moved through the steps, there was a visible strain in her posture, as if each action required her to acknowledge something she had not yet accepted. This is highly irregular, she said, not looking up, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. Avery did not respond immediately, letting the word sit, then answered with quiet precision, no, she said, what is irregular is how long it took you to get here. Melissa's jaw tightened again, but she did not stop typing, because stopping now would only make it worse. The security guard took another step back, creating more space between himself and the desk, his role now fully dissolved into observation. The room itself felt different, not louder, but more aware, as if every person present understood they were witnessing something shift beyond a simple transaction. The younger woman finally spoke again, her voice soft but clear. You could have just checked, she said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what now felt undeniable. Melissa did not respond, because there was no answer that would not expose the truth beneath her decisions. Avery watched the screen as the final confirmation processed, the transaction approved, the system doing exactly what it had been capable of doing from the beginning, and for a moment, no one spoke. The silence now no longer tense, but revealing, like a mirror held up to everything that had just unfolded. Melissa printed the confirmation, her movements precise but slower than before, then slid the paper across the desk toward Avery. It is complete, she said, her voice controlled, but lacking the authority it once carried. Avery looked down at the paper briefly, then back up at Melissa, her expression unchanged. That part was always going to be complete, she said, her tone calm, but carrying a weight that extended beyond the transaction itself. Melissa's eyes flickered, just for a second, because she understood what was being said, that the real issue had never been the money, never been the account, it had been the assumption, the narrative built before any facts were checked. Avery picked up the confirmation, holding it lightly, not as proof for herself, but as a symbol of something already established. Then she set it back down on the desk, not taking it with her, because she did not need it. Do you know what the problem was? Avery continued, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on Melissa, and this time, it was not a question, it was an opening. Melissa did not answer, her posture rigid, waiting. Avery stepped slightly closer, just enough to narrow the space between them. You were not verifying risk, she said, you were responding to perception. The words landed Clean, without aggression, but with precision that left no room to deflect. The man in the grey suit shifted again, his gaze dropping to the floor for a moment, as if unwilling to meet the implication directly. The younger woman nodded slightly, almost unconsciously, because she had seen it too, felt it as it happened. Avery straightened again, her tone never rising, never breaking. And once you decided what I was, she continued, everything else became evidence to support it. Melissa's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but nothing came out, because the truth did not offer her a defense. The security guard glanced toward the exit, then back at Avery, his expression now neutral, no longer aligned with any side, just witnessing. Avery let the silence settle one more time, allowing the weight of her words to fully land. Then she spoke again, softer now, but somehow stronger. That is how systems fail, she said, and this time, it was not directed only at Melissa, it was for the room, for everyone who had watched, who had assumed, who had stayed silent, the words moving through the space like a quiet reckoning. And then, just as the moment seemed to reach its natural end, Avery reached into her pocket again, pulling out her phone, her movements unhurried, deliberate. She unlocked it, glanced at the screen, and then looked back up, her eyes steady, her voice returning to that same calm certainty. Now, she said, we address everything else. The shift in the room did not reverse, it deepened, because Avery's last words did not close the moment, they expanded it, and as she held her phone in her hand again, the quiet authority in her posture made it clear that what had just happened was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something far more uncomfortable. Melissa straightened instinctively, as if preparing for another round of control, but there was a subtle tension now in her shoulders, the kind that comes when certainty has already been broken once and cannot be fully rebuilt. There is nothing else to address, Melissa said, her voice measured, attempting to regain structure, but the words felt premature, like an attempt to move past something that had not yet finished unfolding. Avery did not respond immediately, she simply looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a kind of clarity that made the space between them feel smaller, more defined. You think this was about the transaction, Avery said finally, her tone calm, almost reflective, and that alone was enough to shift the attention back to her, to pull the room into focus again. Melissa did not answer, but her expression tightened slightly. Avery continued, it was never about the money, she said, and now the words carried a different weight, something that reached beyond the desk, beyond the system, into the room itself. It was about how quickly you decided I did not belong here. The younger woman lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, more certain now, as if recognizing something she had felt but not yet named. The man in the grey suit remained still, but his posture had changed, no longer leaning forward, no longer engaged in silent approval, just present, listening. Avery glanced down at her phone, then back up, her voice steady. I want every internal note, every flagged interaction, every compliance report tied to this branch in the last 12 months, she said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a precision that suggested this was not a request, it was already in motion. Melissa blinked, caught off guard. That is not information you have access to, she replied quickly, the reflex immediate, but the confidence behind it weaker than before. Avery tilted her head slightly. You are sure about that? She asked, and the question did not sound like a challenge, it sounded like a test, one that had already been passed somewhere else. Melissa hesitated, just long enough for the room to feel it, just long enough for the balance to shift again. The security guard glanced between them, then subtly stepped even farther back, creating distance not just physically, but from the situation itself, because whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something he was meant to control. Avery lifted her phone again, pressing it lightly to her ear. Confirm access, she said, her voice quiet but clear, and this time, there was a faint response audible, not distinct, but present enough to signal that the call was real, immediate, active. Avery nodded once, then lowered the phone, her eyes returning to Melissa. It is already being pulled, she said, and that sentence did not land as a threat, it landed as fact. The younger woman's eyes widened slightly, her attention sharpening. The man in the grey suit shifted again, his discomfort now visible in the way he adjusted his posture, as if trying to reposition himself away from the unfolding consequences. Melissa's composure tightened, her arms crossing again, but this time the gesture felt defensive rather than authoritative. You cannot just initiate an audit because you are unhappy with service, she said, the words coming faster now, less controlled. Avery did not react to the tone, she simply responded, this is not about service, she said, this is about conduct, and the distinction settled heavily into the room, because conduct implied something deeper, something systemic, something that extended beyond a single interaction. Melissa opened her mouth again, but stopped, because there was nothing left that would restore the ground she had lost. Avery stepped back slightly from the desk. Not retreating, just widening the space, giving the moment room to settle, her voice softer now, but no less firm. You called security before you checked the system, she said. You used language that assumed guilt before you had evidence, each sentence measured, each one building without raising volume, without urgency, just clarity, and you did it in front of a room full of people who followed your lead. The man in the grey suit looked away again. His earlier alignment now something he seemed unwilling to hold on to. The younger woman nodded once more, almost imperceptibly, but enough to signal that the shift was complete. Avery let the silence settle again, longer this time, allowing the weight of everything to fully land. Then she spoke again, her voice calm, final. This is how patterns repeat, she said, and now the word pattern returned, but with more weight, more meaning, not because people do not know better, she continued, but because they are never required to answer for it. Melissa's posture stiffened, but she said nothing, because the room had already changed, the narrative had already shifted, and there was no longer a place to hide behind procedure. Avery glanced at her phone once more, then back up, her expression steady, unwavering. That changes today, she said quietly, and the certainty in her voice did not rise, it settled, like something already decided long before she walked into the room. No one spoke right away after Avery's words settled, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time since this began, every person in that room understood that whatever came next would not be contained within the walls of that lounge. The shift had gone beyond discomfort, beyond embarrassment, it had crossed into consequence, and Melissa felt it, not in the way she stood, because her posture remained upright, controlled, but in the way her eyes moved, no longer scanning for control, but searching for ground that no longer held. You are overstepping, Melissa said finally, her voice steady on the surface, but carrying a faint strain underneath, the kind that comes when control is asserted without certainty. Avery did not react to the words themselves, she focused on the tone, the intent behind them, and when she spoke, it was just as measured, just as calm. No, she said, I am correcting. And the difference between those two words hung in the air long enough to shift the meaning of everything that had come before. The younger woman leaned back in her chair, her expression no longer questioning, now attentive, as if she understood that she was witnessing something that would not repeat itself in the same way again. The man in the grey suit exhaled quietly, adjusting his cuff as though attempting to restore a sense of normalcy that no longer existed. Avery's phone vibrated softly in her hand, a brief signal, subtle but precise. She glanced at the screen, then back up, her eyes locking onto Melissa's. They have it, she said, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just confirmation. Melissa frowned slightly. Have what? She asked, but the question came too quickly, revealing more than it concealed. Avery took a step to the side, not away from the desk, but enough to shift her position in the room, to make it clear that this was no longer a private exchange between two people. This was something being laid out in front of everyone. Every flagged interaction tied to this branch in the last 12 months, she said, her voice even, but now carrying a weight that extended beyond the moment. 8 incidents involving account access disputes, she continued, 6 of them involving clients who were asked for additional verification after presenting valid credentials. Melissa's expression tightened, not dramatically, but enough to register, enough for the room to feel the shift. Avery did not pause. She did not look at her phone again. She did not need to. 4 of those clients were asked to step away from service areas before their accounts were checked, she added, her tone steady, precise, each detail landing without emphasis, without exaggeration, just fact. The younger woman's eyes widened slightly, her attention fully locked now. The man in the grey suit shifted again, his earlier detachment replaced by something closer to discomfort, because this was no longer about a single interaction, it was about a pattern, and patterns were harder to dismiss. Melissa's arms tightened across her chest. You are taking this out of context, she said, but the words lacked the firmness they once had. Avery tilted her head slightly, not dismissing, just acknowledging the attempt. Context is exactly what this is, she replied, and it is consistent. The security guard remained still, but his gaze lowered briefly, as if unwilling to fully engage with what was now unfolding. Avery took another small step, positioning herself so that her voice carried evenly across the room, not raised, not projected, just clear. And in 5 of those cases, she continued, The clients left without completing their transactions. The silence that followed was different now, heavier, not tense in the same way as before, but weighted with recognition, the kind that does not require explanation. Melissa shook her head slightly. That does not prove anything, she said, but even she did not sound convinced by her own words. Avery did not respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of the numbers settle, then she spoke again, softer this time, but somehow more direct. It proves that what happened today was not new, she said, and that sentence landed deeper than anything else, because it removed the possibility of this being an isolated mistake. The younger woman looked down briefly, then back up, her expression firm now, no longer uncertain. The man in the grey suit avoided eye contact altogether, shifting his attention to the floor, as if distancing himself from the implications. Avery's voice remained steady, unwavering. You did not just make a bad call, she said, you repeated a system that has been allowed to operate without question. Melissa opened her mouth, but closed it again, because there was nothing left to anchor her response. Avery let the moment settle fully, allowing every person in the room to sit with what had just been revealed. Then she spoke again, her tone calm, final, and now, she said, it is no longer invisible. The silence did not break, it settled deeper, heavier, as if the room itself understood that what had just been revealed could not be undone or ignored, and for a brief moment no one moved, not Melissa, not the guard, not the clients who had once quietly supported the unfolding assumptions, because now those assumptions had shape, they had numbers, they had history, and that made them harder to dismiss. Avery stood at the center of it without shifting, without claiming space, yet somehow occupying all of it. Her presence no longer questioned, no longer interpreted, just undeniable. Melissa's lips parted slightly, her posture still rigid, but there was a visible fracture now, not in her stance, but in her certainty. You are drawing conclusions, she said, but the words felt distant, like something repeated out of habit rather than belief. Avery did not challenge the statement directly, she let it pass, then responded with quiet precision. No, she said, I am reading patterns that your system already recorded, and that distinction carried weight, because it removed opinion entirely. It left only data, only documented behavior. The younger woman shifted in her seat, her hands tightening slightly together, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when something long felt but never confirmed is finally spoken out loud. The man in the grey suit remained still, but his eyes no longer met anyone else's, fixed instead on the marble floor as if distance could separate him from what had already happened. Avery's phone vibrated again, softer this time, almost like a confirmation echo. She glanced at it briefly, then lifted her gaze back to Melissa. There is more, she said, and those 3 words did not raise her tone, but they deepened the moment, because they implied that what had already been revealed was only part of it. Melissa's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly. This is unnecessary, she said, but now there was urgency in her voice, subtle but present, the kind that appears when control is no longer guaranteed. Avery took a slow breath, not for herself, but for the space, as if giving the room a moment to absorb what was about to follow. 3 internal complaints, she continued, filed by clients who reported being questioned about the legitimacy of their funds despite presenting verified accounts. She paused just long enough for the words to settle, then added, all 3 were dismissed without escalation. The younger woman's eyes widened again, her posture straightening, her attention now fully locked, not on Avery, but on the unfolding truth. Melissa shook her head slightly. Complaints do not equal misconduct, she said quickly, but the speed of her response revealed more than the content of it. Avery nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it. That is correct, she said, but patterns do, and that word returned again, heavier now, layered with everything that had already been laid out. The security guard shifted his weight, his stance no longer aligned with authority, just present, watching, as if understanding that whatever this had become was no longer within his scope. Avery's voice remained calm, steady, but now there was something else beneath it, something firmer, something final. And today, she continued, you added another one. The room did not react outwardly, but the shift was unmistakable, like a current passing through everyone at once. Melissa's jaw tightened, her eyes narrowing slightly. You are turning a misunderstanding into something it is not, she said, but the words lacked foundation, they floated without landing. Avery stepped slightly to the side again, widening her position in the room, making it clear that this was no longer confined to a single interaction at a desk. No, she said, I am showing you exactly what it is, and the clarity in her voice removed any remaining ambiguity. The younger woman leaned forward slightly, her her voice steady when she spoke. "You should have checked first," she said, not to Avery, but to Melissa, and that shift, that moment where a bystander became a voice, changed the dynamic completely. Because now the room was no longer silent, it was engaged. Melissa turned her head slightly toward her, but did not respond, because there was no answer that would restore what had already been lost. Avery let the moment breathe, let the silence expand just enough to hold everything that had been said. Then she spoke again, softer now, but with a clarity that carried through the entire space. "This is not about proving me right," she said, "it is about making sure this does not happen again." And that sentence did not accuse, it defined purpose. It reframed everything from confrontation to correction, from defense to accountability. The man in the grey suit shifted again, his discomfort now unmistakable. The younger woman nodded once more firmly this time, and even the guard's posture reflected it, a subtle acknowledgement that the balance had fully shifted. Avery glanced down at her phone one last time, then back up, her expression steady, unwavering. "The review is already in motion," she said quietly, and the certainty in her voice made it clear that this was no longer a conversation. It was a process unfolding in real time, one that would not pause, would not adjust, would not disappear. And as the weight of that settled into the room, it became clear that the moment they were standing in was not just about what had happened, but about what would follow, and that was something none of them could control anymore. The room no longer felt like a place of service, it felt like a place of exposure, where every word spoken moments ago had not disappeared but instead settled into something permanent, something that could not be taken back or reshaped. And as Avery stood there, steady and unmoved, it became clear that the power in the room had shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Melissa remained behind the desk, but the position no longer gave her authority, it only marked where she had been standing when everything changed, her posture still upright, but the certainty that once held it together had thinned. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," Melissa said, her voice controlled, but the effort behind it now visible, the kind that comes when someone tries to contain something already expanding beyond their reach. Avery looked at her for a moment, not with confrontation, but with clarity. "It was already big," she said, "you just did not see it until now." And that sentence did not rise, it settled, like something that had always been true whether acknowledged or not. The younger woman nodded slightly again, this time without hesitation, her voice calm but firm when she spoke. "She is right," she said, and that simple agreement carried more weight than any argument could have, because it came from someone who had no stake in the outcome, only in what was fair. The man in the grey suit shifted again, but this time he spoke, his voice quieter, measured. It did seem rushed, he admitted, not fully aligning, but no longer defending, and that subtle shift completed the room's transition. Melissa glanced at him briefly, then back at Avery, her expression tightening, because now the room was no longer behind her, it was watching her, and that was a different kind of pressure entirely. Avery did not react to the support, she did not acknowledge it outwardly. Because this was never about gathering agreement, it was about revealing truth, and that had already happened. Her phone vibrated again, a longer signal this time. She lifted it slowly, listening for a brief moment, then nodded once, her expression unchanged. "Understood," she said quietly, ending the call. Then she looked back at Melissa, and for the first time, there was a slight shift in her tone, not louder, not emotional, but final. "They have completed the initial review," she said, and those words did not sound like an update, they sounded like a turning point. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly. "You cannot conduct a review this fast," she said, but the statement lacked conviction, because she no longer knew what Avery could or could not do. Avery took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the next words land clearly. "You are thinking in terms of permission," she said. "I am working in terms of authority." And that distinction changed everything, because it reframed the entire situation, not as a complaint being processed, but as a system being activated. The younger woman's eyes widened again, the realization settling in. The man in the grey suit looked up briefly, his expression shifting from discomfort to something closer to understanding. Melissa's posture stiffened, her voice sharpening slightly. "And what authority would that be?" she asked, and the question, though intended to challenge, carried something else now, uncertainty. Avery held her gaze for a moment, letting the question sit, letting the room lean into it, and then she answered, her voice calm, precise, and unmistakably clear, the kind that does not need to be explained before it is enforced. And the silence that followed was immediate, complete, because the meaning was not hidden, it was felt. The security guard shifted again, his stance now entirely neutral, no longer part of any enforcement, just a witness to What had become something far beyond his role? Avery continued, her tone steady. The branch compliance team has been flagged, she said. Your access logs are under review, and every interaction tied to this desk today has been preserved. Each word landed clean, without urgency, without aggression, just fact. Melissa's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, because the ground beneath her had fully shifted now, and there was nothing left to stand on that had not already been questioned. Avery let the moment settle, letting the weight of the process become real in the room. Then she spoke again, softer now, but carrying more authority than anything she had said before. This is what accountability looks like, she said, and the sentence did not accuse, it defined, it clarified, it made visible something that had been hidden behind routine and assumption. The younger woman sat back slowly, absorbing it. The man in the grey suit looked down again, no longer avoiding, but processing, and Melissa stood there, still, silent, because for the first time, she was no longer directing the outcome, she was part of it. Avery glanced around the room one more time, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, and then she returned her gaze to Melissa, her voice calm, final. Now you understand, she said, this was never about the transaction. The words did not echo, but they lingered, settling into the room with a finality that no one could ignore, and for a moment everything stood still, not frozen, but suspended, as if the space itself needed time to adjust to what had just been made clear. Melissa did not respond immediately, her silence no longer controlled, no longer strategic, but exposed, because there was nothing left to counter with, no procedure to reference, no authority to lean on, only the weight of what had already been revealed. Avery remained where she stood, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, not pressing forward, not stepping back, simply holding the space with a calm that no longer needed to prove anything. The younger woman shifted slightly in her seat, her expression no longer uncertain but grounded, as if she had crossed from observer to witness. The man in the grey suit adjusted his jacket slowly, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet distance, not from Avery, but from everything he had silently supported minutes before. The security guard remained still near the edge of the room, his role now completely dissolved into observation, no longer a factor in what was unfolding. Avery's phone remained in her hand, but she did not look at it again. She did not need confirmation anymore, because the process she had set in motion had already moved beyond this room, beyond this moment. Melissa finally exhaled, a controlled breath, but one that carried the strain of everything she had not said. You are implying misconduct, she said, her voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, and the statement did not challenge, it acknowledged. Avery tilted her head slightly, not dismissing, not correcting, just clarifying. I am stating what is already documented, she replied, and the difference between implication and documentation landed clearly, leaving no room for reinterpretation. Melissa's eyes flickered briefly, a small movement, but enough to reveal that she understood the distinction, because documentation did not argue. It did not negotiate, it simply existed. The younger woman leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but firm when she spoke. You did not check first, she said again, but this time the words carried more weight, because they were no longer an observation, they were a conclusion. The man in the grey suit nodded once, almost reluctantly, as if confirming something he had already accepted internally. Avery let the silence stretch again, not to create tension, but to allow recognition to settle fully into the room. Then she spoke, her tone unchanged, but now carrying a sense of closure that had not been there before. This is the moment where most people try to explain it away, she said, her eyes steady on Melissa. They call it a misunderstanding, they call it a miscommunication, they say it was a mistake. She paused just long enough for those words to register, then continued, but mistakes do not follow patterns. And that sentence landed with quiet precision, cutting through any remaining attempt to minimize what had happened. Melissa's posture tightened again, but she did not interrupt, because she no longer had a position from which interruption would hold. Avery stepped slightly to the side, not distancing herself, but shifting the dynamic once more, making it clear that this was no longer confined to a single exchange. This was something the entire room was now part of. You made a decision before you had information, she said, and then you acted on it as if it were fact. Her voice remained calm, measured, but each word carried weight, not because of volume, but because of clarity. The younger woman nodded again, more firmly this time, no hesitation left in her expression. The man in the grey suit looked down briefly, then back up, his gaze no longer avoiding, but acknowledging. Melissa finally spoke again, her voice quieter now, almost careful. What exactly do you expect to happen from this? She asked. And the question, though simple, carried something new, not resistance, but uncertainty. Avery met her gaze without hesitation. What should have happened in the first place, she said, and the answer did not come with explanation, because it did not need one. The room understood. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of recognition, of realization, of a shift that had already taken place and could not be reversed. Avery let that silence settle completely, then she spoke. One last time, her voice calm, steady, and final. You do not get to decide who belongs in a system you do not understand, she said, and the words did not rise, they settled, like something that had always been true, whether acknowledged or not, and as they did, it became clear that whatever authority had once defined this room had already changed hands, not through force, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and that clarity left no room for anything else to stand. No one rushed to fill the silence that followed, because it no longer felt like something that needed to be filled, it felt like something that needed to be understood, and in that stillness the room shifted one final time, not in tension, not in uncertainty, but in acceptance of what had already taken place. Melissa stood behind the desk, but the position no longer carried meaning, it was just a place, not a role, not a shield. Her hands rested lightly on the edge of the counter, not gripping, not steadying, just there, as if even she understood that nothing she did with them would change what had already been set in motion. Avery remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence calm, but now it carried something else, not pressure, not confrontation, but resolution, the kind that comes when something has reached its natural conclusion. Her phone vibrated once more, a brief signal, and this time she answered without hesitation, lifting it to her ear. Yes, she said, her voice low, controlled, listening for a moment before responding again. Proceed, and that single word did not sound like instruction, it sounded like confirmation, like something already agreed upon long before this moment began. Melissa's eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in an attempt to follow what she could no longer control. Proceed with what? She asked, but her voice had changed, the edge was gone, replaced by something quieter, more careful. Avery lowered the phone slowly, her gaze returning to Melissa, steady, direct, formal review and immediate suspension of discretionary authority at this branch, she said, and the words did not rise, they settled, like something that had already taken effect, not something waiting to happen. The younger woman inhaled softly, her posture straightening as the meaning landed. The man in the grey suit looked up fully now, no longer avoiding, no longer distant, just present, aware that he was witnessing something irreversible. Melissa's lips parted, but no words came out at first, because the sentence had already removed the ground she stood on. You cannot make that decision, she said finally, but the statement lacked strength, because even she no longer believed it fully. Avery tilted her head slightly, not dismissing, not correcting, just clarifying. It has already been made, she replied, and the difference between future and present could not have been clearer. The security guard shifted again, but this time not out of uncertainty, out of recognition, stepping back toward the entrance, no longer part of the scene at all, just someone who had been present when it changed. Avery took a slow step back from the desk, not retreating, but creating space, allowing the moment to expand beyond the immediate exchange. Your access will be restricted within the next few minutes, she continued, her tone steady. All client-facing decisions will be reviewed by corporate compliance until further notice. Each sentence delivered without emphasis, without force, just clarity. The younger woman's eyes moved from Avery to Melissa, then back again, absorbing the shift fully now. The man in the grey suit adjusted his posture once more, but this time it was not discomfort, it was recognition. An understanding that what he had just witnessed would not be undone or explained away. Later, Melissa straightened instinctively, her posture returning, but without the foundation it once had. This is excessive, she said, but the words felt distant, disconnected from the reality unfolding in front of her. Avery met her gaze evenly. No, she said, this is measured, and that distinction carried weight, because it removed any suggestion of emotion or reaction, replacing it with intention, process, accountability. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer tense, it was attentive. Every person present now fully aware that what had happened was not just an interaction, it was a turning point. Avery glanced briefly toward the entrance, then back to Melissa, her expression unchanged, her voice calm, final. You asked what happens next, she said. This is what happens when a system is required to answer for itself, and that sentence did not accuse, it defined, it clarified. It made visible something that had been hidden behind routine and assumption for far too long. Melissa did not respond, because there was nothing left to respond with. the structure she had relied on had shifted, and she was now inside it rather than above it. Avery let the silence settle one last time, allowing the full weight of the moment to land. Then she turned slightly, not leaving, not yet, just repositioning, her presence still centered, still calm, but no longer needing to hold the room together because the room had already changed. And as that realization settled into every corner of the space, it became clear that what had just taken place was not simply a correction, it was a reset, quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. The room did not return to normal, it could not, because normal had already been exposed as something flawed, something incomplete, and now every detail in that space carried a different meaning. The polished marble, the quiet lighting, the controlled tone of service, all of it still there, but no longer unquestioned. Avery stood with the same calm presence, but she no longer held the moment. The moment had moved beyond her, into the system, into the process she had already set in motion. Melissa remained behind the desk, but the desk itself had become just a surface, no longer a position of control, her hands now resting flat against it as if grounding herself in something that was already shifting beneath her. Her eyes moved briefly toward the terminal, then back to Avery, as if searching for something familiar in a situation that had already changed too much to recognize. "This will be reviewed," Melissa said finally, her voice steady but lower, as if choosing each word carefully now. Avery nodded once, acknowledging the statement without needing to challenge it. "It already is," she replied, and the distinction was immediate. Review was no longer something pending. It was something active, something unfolding in real time. The younger woman adjusted her posture again, sitting straighter, more engaged, no longer a passive observer. The man in the grey suit remained quiet, but his stillness now carried a different weight, not avoidance, but awareness, as if he understood that what he had witnessed would stay with him long after he left the room. Avery's phone vibrated softly again. She glanced down briefly, then back up, her expression unchanged. "Corporate compliance has initiated a full branch assessment," she said. Her tone even. "All discretionary decisions made today are under review, including escalation protocols and language used during client interactions, each word precise, each one expanding the scope beyond a single moment, beyond a single decision." Melissa's posture stiffened slightly. "Language," she repeated, almost under her breath, and that one word carried recognition, because language had been the first shift, the first decision. The moment where assumption became action. Avery held her gaze. "That is where it started," she said, and the simplicity of the statement made it heavier, not lighter, because it pointed directly to the moment everything had turned. The younger woman nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on Avery now, fully aligned with what had been revealed. The security guard stood near the entrance, no longer part of the interaction at all, just someone who had witnessed the transition from assumption to accountability. Avery took a small step back, not disengaging, just allowing space for the reality of the situation to settle fully. "This is not about removing authority," she continued, her voice calm. "It is about redefining how it is used," and that distinction reframed everything once again, from punishment to correction, from reaction to structure. Melissa's eyes flickered again, not with defiance, but with something quieter, something closer to realization, because for the first time, she was no longer defending her actions, she was processing them. Avery glanced briefly around the room, taking in the faces that had once been part of the assumption and were now part of the awareness. Then she returned her gaze to Melissa, her tone steady, final. "Every system reflects the people who operate it," she said, and today, that reflection became visible. The word settled into the room like a closing statement, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. The younger woman exhaled softly, her posture relaxing slightly, not because the tension was gone, but because it had been replaced with clarity. The man in the grey suit looked up again, his expression neutral but thoughtful, no longer distant, just present in the understanding of what had taken place. Melissa remained still, her hand still on the desk, her posture upright but no longer rigid, because the resistance had already passed, replaced by something quieter, something unavoidable. Avery let the silence settle one last time, not to create effect, but to allow the moment to fully land. Then she spoke again, softer now, but with a clarity that carried through every corner of the room. "This is where it changes," she said, and the words did not sound like a promise, they sounded like a conclusion, like something already set into motion that would not reverse, would not fade, would not be ignored. And as that final statement settled into the space, it became clear that the moment they had all witnessed was not just a correction of one decision, it was the beginning of something larger, something that would extend far beyond that room, long After the doors closed and the silence returned. The room did not erupt into applause or reaction. It did not need to, because what had happened did not require noise to be understood. It required stillness, and that stillness now carried something different, not tension, not discomfort, but clarity, the kind that lingers long after words have been spoken. Avery stood quietly, her presence no longer anchoring the room, because the room had already shifted on its own. The system she had set in motion was no longer visible, but it was active. And that was enough. Melissa remained behind the desk, but the distance between where she stood and what she represented had grown, her posture still upright, but no longer rigid, no longer defensive, just present in a moment she could not reverse. Her eyes moved once more across the space, not searching for control, but recognizing what had changed. The younger woman slowly closed her laptop, her gaze steady, her expression thoughtful, no longer uncertain, no longer passive. The man in the grey suit adjusted his stance, but this time it was not out of discomfort, it was out of quiet acknowledgement, a recognition that he had witnessed something real, something that would stay with him beyond this room. Avery took a slow breath, not out of relief, not out of exhaustion, but out of completion, the kind that comes when something has reached its natural end. She reached for the confirmation slip on the desk, not because she needed it, but because it marked the moment where assumption had been replaced with fact. Then she folded it once, cleanly, and set it back down exactly where it had been, a quiet gesture, deliberate, precise, like everything else she had done. Melissa finally spoke again, her voice lower now, measured, no longer carrying the edge it once had. "This will be addressed," she said, and this time the words did not sound like defense, they sounded like acceptance. Avery nodded once, not in approval, not in agreement, just acknowledgement, because the process was already beyond words now, beyond promises, beyond statements. It was in motion, and that was what mattered. She stepped back from the desk fully now, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, separating herself from the moment as it settled into something larger than either of them. The security guard remained near the entrance, his posture relaxed, his role complete without ever fully engaging. The younger woman stood slowly, her movements deliberate, as if carrying the weight of what she had witnessed. The man in the grey suit looked toward Avery briefly, then gave a small nod, not of apology, not of agreement, but of recognition. Avery met it with the same calm she had carried throughout, nothing more, nothing less. She turned slightly toward the exit, her steps measured, unhurried, the same way she had entered. No urgency, no need to look back, because everything that needed to happen had already begun, and it would continue without her presence. As she moved across the marble floor, the room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same quiet as before. It was not the quiet of assumption, it was the quiet of awareness, the kind that changes how people see, how they think, how they act. Long after the moment has passed, Avery reached the doorway, pausing for just a fraction of a second, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to acknowledge the shift that had taken place. Then she spoke one final time, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably clear. "I did not need to prove who I was," she said. "I needed you to see what you were doing." And with that, she stepped forward, leaving the room not as someone who had won, but as someone who had revealed. And behind her, the system she had exposed continued to move, quiet, precise, and irreversible, because the truth, once seen, does not disappear, it remains, reshaping everything that follows. And in that room, on that day, it had already begun.